previous.
Did I see it?
Stop it.
Madam Mayor, it's 6:03 and we're live.
That's good.
It's debatable.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this Thursday, October 10th, City Commission Work Session Capital Improvement Budget to order and ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mayor Pam Triolo,
Here.
Vice Mayor Andy Amoroso,
Here.
Commissioner Scott Maxwell,
Here.
Commissioner Omari Hardy,
Here.
Commissioner Herman Robinson.
Here.
If everyone would please rise for the pledge, led by Commissioner Hardy.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we have a work session in order today. We're going to talk first about our 5-year utility capital improvement plan. City Manager, did you want to lead us in discussion?
Yes, Madam Mayor, I'd like to open with a little sort of overview of how we're going to go through the workshop and some follow-up discussions that may occur at the next workshop. As you stated, tonight we're going to be talking about overall our capital improvement plan for the city. The way it's set up tonight is we've divided it into 2 segments, so it's a little easier to digest, and also to recognize some of the differences in funding and financing that we're going to have to do in the utility side of the equation. So we're first going to have a conversation about the utility capital improvement plan. We'll go over the spreadsheet. If anybody has any questions, y'all have the data of the various projects that the utilities have put forward, and then we'll have our financial advisors from Davenport go over a restructuring discussion about the debt. After that's completed, we're going to go back into looking at the spreadsheets, and in the general capital improvement plan are all the other funds that are really not the utility funds. And there's been a lot of deferred capital over the years that the city hasn't been able to adequately address. So while we were going through this comprehensive program and with the help of the finance director and staff, we've put together a package of items that your professional staff believes we need to throw on the table as items that we need to have a conversation about going forward in the capital improvement plan. Anything that comes out of the meeting tonight for additional conversation, data, you may want us to do a different shrift of the data. We'll gladly do that and follow up and have that available at the October 17th meeting, so that I want to remind you that that's available next week, because we're going to be having another workshop. Along with the conversation of anything that may come out of this meeting, we're also going to have that kitchen table conversation we've talked about on several of the items, including the beach complex. So with that said, that's the framework. I'll go ahead and allow Bruce to start the first part of the conversation on the spreadsheet of the capital improvement projects. And Bruce, take it away, please.
Good evening, everybody. Bruce Miller, Finance Director, for the record. Before I get started, I just wanted to, I dropped off a vanilla folder in front of you, and it has all the new updated spreadsheets. It also has a presentation. So, and I apologize, but there were some of the documents, if you went through, we didn't have the detail analysis behind it, so we want to make sure that you have a full packet with all the relevant information.
Just to clarify, is the spreadsheet basically the same?
The spreadsheet
It's
is
the
essentially
project
same.
listing in the back, which
Exactly.
was the individual project details. So the spreadsheet hasn't changed.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so talking about the governmental funds, in your packet, there's a summary schedule. It's on the landscape legal, which I'll be working from. And I just wanted a broad brush picture of the utilities. So what we have is by year, working from left to right, fiscal year 20, the request. So it goes down from electric company, water fund, et cetera, et cetera. So in fiscal year 20, we have $49 million worth of requests. Of that $49 million, $2.4 million has associated funding. Does everybody have the schedule?
Would you repeat that, please?
The governmental funds?
The governmental funds?
No.
I'm looking at utilities.
No, we're starting on utilities.
Oh, no, he
Yes, utilities,
he
I'm sorry.
said, though, he was starting
Okay,
on the
okay.
other one, that's why.
So the utilities,
Okay.
Exactly.
Are there any copies for anyone in the audience? We have copies for anyone in the audience?
copies were put up on the screen.
What was the one I had?
Yeah.
This
he
is
did.
the government.
No, we're on utility funds. He said governmental, but we're on utility.
Oh.
It'll be coming up on the screen. We're experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by.
If you go to the governmental summary.
And Madam Mayor, may I ask, is what's on these screens in this room, I'm wondering, is that going to show up on YouTube?
Yeah.
Okay. So whatever's on this screen will be what's on YouTube,
For people to see at home.
right?
We're just
'Cause
making,
these
we're just
documents
making
are not
sure.
available online.
You ready?
Okay, ready?
They're there? Okay, there we go.
All right, so if you, column C is the fiscal year 2020 request. So all funds, all utility funds, and we're combining the utility funds, and you'll hear more of this later on this evening when Davenport does their presentation. But we're combining utilities all together because we're looking at one comprehensive utility debt issuance versus individual enterprise funds. So vis-a-vis the utility heading. So fiscal year 20, $49 million. Of that, $2.4 million is funded. So the net borrowing is $47,245,000. So going out for the 5-year total, the total request, and that is if you would pan out to the total, so everybody can see it. The total request is approximately $140 million. That's under column W. And then in column X is the total amount that has available funding for a required funding of $135 million. Now, please note that some of these numbers will, depending upon the out years, especially in the out years, these numbers probably will change a little bit as we move forward and refine the capital budgets year over year. Some of the funding areas may change to borrowing, depending upon fund balance and other available funding. So it's a stacked document, but for fiscal year 20, we're very confident that these are the requests that will be put forward.
May I interrupt for a second? City Manager?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you just explain for people at home too, we're not talking, this isn't like a standard budget, this is our capital funding budget, and explain what capital funding is. I know it's for us, but I just want people at home to understand what we're actually talking about a budget for.
Yes, Madam Mayor, Mayor and Commissioners, the data we're discussing is separate and apart from your operations budget, your operation and maintenance budget that was approved by the end of September, which is required by state law. Y'all went through a process and approved that. This is a separate conversation just for capital expenditures, and they've been bundled together, and it's a little out of sync. Normally, it would be done at the same time. We've moved it to have this separate conversation, and you can see it's pretty daunting, the amount of information. But capital, as defined, is a expenditure for something that has a lifespan of greater than 5 years or more than $25,000 in expense. So the projects in here, in the utility side, it would be things in the electric utility, for example, that would include substation work, fixing circuits that have been neglected for years, and a lot of the things that have been identified as what I've said in the past is catching up on 40 to 50 years of benign neglect. And it's investing in that asset that the residents own, known as the electric utility. Same thing with the water, the sewer, the regional sewer, and the various funds. Each one had projects totaling, if you put them all together, $140 million over the period of 5 years. The largest one of that would be the electric utility. So we're talking about those kinds of investments, not operational dollars, not salaries, not expenses for keeping the lights on in this building. It's just capital items. We'll get into then a general government discussion of items that aren't related to the utility, and we've separated that out. But again, it's the same definition of items. It could be roof replacement, redoing the wiring, which is ancient in the annex building, or replacing the roof on the old the band shell in Bryant Park, which has needed to be fixed for many years. Those kinds of things are what we're going to be talking about. Does that help?
That totally does. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
So, if I may, I want to go through the detail sheet. So, Corinne, if you could tab to the utility funds and go all the way over to the left and go all the way to the electric component, just so that you understand how things relate from one spreadsheet to another. So you have the summary schedule in front of you that we just went through, but on the detail schedule, it's the same number of years going out. On the 2020 request, so just looking at the electric fund, you'll see all the detailed projects under project title, and then the 2020 request. If you note, there's a $28 million subtotal, and you can tie that directly to the summary sheet of $28 million. Okay, and then the funding under the 20 funded amount is equal to the PAYGO amount and the reallocation of fund balance and the grant, and then you get the net borrowing amount. So all those detailed summary totals move up to your summary schedule. So this detailed analysis provides you project by project for not just fiscal year 20, but through fiscal year 24, a 5-year plan. Now, there's a little bit of nuance there in that this is a plan, and it's also reflective of appropriations. So that's why we're asking, what's being reflected, some of this information is already funded, but we needed appropriation to go with the project. So it's a very comprehensive list from for all the enterprise funds.
Hardy?
So I just want to be clear. The stuff on here some of it's funded, some of it's not. As in, for some of these things in this list, there are funds that can be used. And for most of the things on this list, whether we appropriate it or not, there's nothing to appropriate.
That's correct.
Okay.
The amounts that are recommended for funding source
Uh-huh.
are under the pay-go columns and under the reallocation of fund balance.
Okay.
That's the recommended source of funds by the departments. But again, that is a recommendation. That appropriation is required by this group. So if you, for whatever reason, disagree with that appropriation, then it changes the conversation.
Okay. And for the 2020 fiscal year request, I just want to be clear. It looks like you got requests of 21 million total. Okay. And there's only funding for 15. Am I right about that? About 16.
Well, if you would go down to the bottom, okay, there's $49 million of requests, $49.6 million
For 2020 alone?
for 2020 alone.
I don't have that on. Well, this is the backup that I got.
Are you on the
earlier in week.
electric?
Okay, so let me.
Just,
Are you on the electric or are you on the general?
No, I'm on the general, and I was using what I was given.
We're on
earlier in the
electric.
week. Oh, okay. All right.
Sorry,
never mind.
Commissioner.
Okay.
it's right here.
And those numbers didn't sound right, does it?
I had a question.
You should be on the utility fund.
Page 5 of 6.
Okay. All right. Never mind. I'll get to questions.
All right.
Commissioner Robinson?
I had a question on explaining where did it go? The 1601 North Dixie incentive project. You want to clarify that in terms of CRA and?
Sure. And that's a great segue into the last discussion. So behind each of the detail sheets, you have a detail program sheet, all right, which describes in detail the project. And if you take a look up in the top right corner, you'll see in this an EF1, and that goes all the way through. So
What page?
just take a
Up in the
look.
top right is the.
I see.
EF, go to EF11,
So,
That's-
so page 11, basically.
if you tie, so I'm going to let Ed speak to it, but if you have any questions relative to any numbers that are outlined in the schedules, the detail you can trace back.
It's the mid project.
Ed,
Yeah.
Yes, good evening. Ed Liberty, Director of the Electric Utility. The 1601 expenditure for $140 some odd thousand, that was a part of our commitment to help get that project to go. So the electric utility is making a contribution to the project of $146,000, I think 148,
Yeah.
to help that project go. In exchange for that, the developer is doing all of the work to install equipment with that $146,000. It's not like it's a gift. They have to spend that on the electric infrastructure on site for that project. It also has a string attached that says revenues from that project, electric revenues, have to hit a certain level over a period of time. And if they don't, they pay that money back, and that money is secured by a performance bond. So we're guaranteed to get the money back either through revenues from the project, electric revenues, or if they don't hit the target, we collect on the bond and we get the money back. So it helps them get the project going.
For public information, thank you.
Yes.
And you also notice there's a similar item under the water utilities.
Yeah. But it's,
Same.
No, I think it's, thank you, because it is a good idea to explain to the public exactly why that's there and how we arrived at that, what the purpose of it is, and how we get that money back from the increased sales that we'll see on a project that would otherwise remain vacant land for some period of time. Thank you.
All right, so if there's no other questions on the schedules themselves, I'm going to turn the meeting over to the folks from Davenport, Joe Mason and Kyle Lutz.
Good evening, Mayor and Commissioners.
Does it sound on?
Doesn't
You gotta
sound
get
on.
close to it. You gotta get close to it.
Hello?
There you go.
Feel like a lounge singer or something.
Be the microphone.
Mayor and Commissioners, my name is Joe Mason. I'm with Davenport and Company. This is my colleague Kyle Laux. We're very pleased to be here with you this evening. We're going to walk you through a relatively brief presentation. There are several slides, and it sort of progresses from one to the next. So, by all means, if you have questions as we go along, please raise those topics. But I think as we go through, you'll see how it all sort of comes together. Incidentally, we are new to the city. We were hired by competitive procurement earlier this year, but we were invited to submit a response. We do have a prior relationship with Mr. Miller, your Director of Finance, in his prior capacity as the Finance Director in Annapolis, Maryland, and successfully implemented some of the same strategies that we're going to be talking with you about tonight. So, if I may,
There you go.
Manager, and move us along to slide number 3. We've already talked about the fact that you've got about $140 million in combined utility enterprise projects, the vast majority of those for the electric fund. An important point early on here is that your existing cash flows from the combined utility enterprise system, given your current debt profile for the utilities, means that there is not sufficient revenue to fully fund that $140 million capital program. So that's an important thing to keep in the back of your mind as we go through this. We're going to get there, and we're going to show you how we get there in terms of funding it, but it's going to require some strategic changes. So why? And first of all, the CIP is obviously a policy document. The $140 million we're talking about, you need to make your own decisions about what of those projects are to go forward and what might not. That's not our role to tell you what those projects should be. Our role is to give you alternatives for how best to accomplish funding those projects, both in the short run and over time. But it is important to note and understand that the combined utility system generates, and I realize with the recent changes in the operating budget that there's been some tapering off of this, but the combined utilities do provide a substantial amount of cash flow to the city's general fund. So the utilities need to be run as individual businesses, and they need reinvestment from time to time so that they can generate that cash flow. That's a critical part, at least at the margins, of balancing your budget. Okay. So we'll talk just a little bit about what sort of debt the city currently has for its utilities, and that it totals about $70 million, which translates to, over the next 8 years or so, about $7 million a year in debt service. You'll note that the graphic at the bottom shows that your debt service is increasing slightly, and that is a bit unusual for utilities, and it's a reflection of the energy performance contract leases that the city entered into a few years ago. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So of that $70 million, it breaks down as follows. Approximately $40 million of that debt is held by Bank of America. That's the remaining balance outstanding from a larger utility bond financing that was done, we believe, sometime in the 90s. It's been refinanced a couple of times since then, most recently as a direct bank loan with Bank of America in circa 2013, I believe. The other big piece of the energy contracts, the capital leases that are mentioned there, $22 million. And then you've got approximately $7 million in state revolving fund loans for water. Okay. Critically important, none of those outstanding utility revenue bonds of whatever stripe we're talking about have a public bond rating. In contrast, your general obligation bonds that were sold in the last 2 or 3 years over two bond sales Those were the voted general obligation bonds for the road and transportation improvements. Those bonds were actually rated by Moody's Investor Service and Standard & Poor's, two of the three major rating agencies. And you can see the ratings there, AA- by S&P, A1 by Moody's. I can tell you from experience that those are very solid investment grade ratings, certainly above average. So you're to be commended for that. But it's going to be important as we think about the financial plan for how to get the utility improvements funded. We're going to want to go down a similar path, which is to go out and get that new security, that new credit that we're going to discuss, get it rated on an investment grade basis, because that's going to help you borrow at the lowest possible cost of funds. And I'm going to turn it over to Kyle here for a few slides.
Madam Mayor and Commissioners, nice to see you this evening. Kyle Laux with Davenport, and we appreciate the opportunity. So as we think about, on page number 6 here, our current challenge, as we kind of like to phrase it, we've got the existing debt profile that Joe talked about. We've got the $140 or so million of capital that's been identified over the next 5 years. And so as we looked at this, we said to ourselves, all right, how is it that we're going to be able to achieve this and make it affordable, make it financially responsible for the city? And so I think you'll see that over the next couple pages, or at least the beginnings of that as we work through that. I think an important point here, we'll talk throughout here about the combined utility system. So you've got a variety of sort of independent businesses. Each of those will continue to be run and sort of accounted for internally as independent enterprise funds. That's our term we use for sort of a business within your government. But for our purposes, when we think about the rating agencies and lenders, we're going to look at those on a combined basis. And that's a pretty typical practice to sort of combine the overall cash flows and the overall wherewithal of all those various utility funds into what we call a combined utility enterprise credit. So I just want to make that clear as we use that term, what it is we mean by that. On page number 7, Joe mentioned this. One of the things we'll be recommending, and with your blessing working through, is to get the combined utility revenue credit rated by the rating agencies. Again, that's going to help achieve the lowest interest rate or lowest cost of funds as we talk about it in the marketplace. And so you see the credit rating scale there. We've circled the ratings of your general obligation bonds, which again is entirely separate. But to Joe's point, you've got a history and a track record already with the rating agencies on that particular bond issuance of having very solid investment grade credit ratings. So what we'll be doing going forward, again, with your blessing, is to go through a similar kind of process to have our utility enterprise system rated in a similar fashion as the general obligation ratings. And so as we go to page 8, there's going to be a variety of different things that are important within how both the rating agencies and ultimately investors will look at the cash flows of the enterprise systems. And we wanted to highlight 2 of those for you here, and they're arguably the most important on the financial side of the house. There's a lot of words on this page, so I'll try to describe it both for the commissioners and the public. But the first concept is annual debt service coverage. And what that really gets to is the amount of annual cash flow flexibility that you have within the combined utility systems. It is a covenant, which is a legal requirement that you have on your existing revenue bonds with Bank of America. And what it really speaks to is how many times, we kind of use that term, how many times you can cover debt service or pay for debt service after you've paid your operations. Your existing loans have what we call a 120 coverage ratio, which means that after we've paid for operations, we've got $1.20 for every dollar of debt service. And that is a ratio that gets embedded into the indenture and the contract, so to speak, with the bondholders. And so that's an important one because it really speaks to what's the annual flexibility within the utility funds on a financial basis. The second concept at the bottom of the page, as we call there, the cash reserves. And so, again, maybe in your home, you've got a savings account. something of that variety. Similar concept here on the utility system. What the rating agencies and outside investors will want to see and like to see is that we've got annual cash flow flexibility, which is that coverage ratio, but we also have a certain amount of reserves in sort of what we'll call maybe a rainy day fund, or to cover contingencies, whether it be a weather event, et cetera. And so those are two really important financial metrics that get encapsulated in all these revenue bond documents. The rating agencies, lenders will care about them. And so we wanted to point those out as we kind of introduce this topic to you maybe for the first time. On page number 9, one point we want to make clear, especially as it relates to that annual rate covenant or the coverage ratio, is that it is really a requirement of the indenture when you go out and do revenue bonds. And that's typical, whether it's in Lake Worth Beach or anywhere else. That's how revenue bond issue works. So, I suspect you'll hear at various times when it comes to financial matters, it's a best practice to do something, or you should have a certain amount of reserves. I think what's important to note here is that debt service coverage is a best practice, and it's a requirement that gets built into the legal documents. And so it protects both the lenders and the investors who are going to lend and invest in the city, and allows them basically to lend to you at the lowest possible interest rate, because they're going to be comfortable that you have at least a minimum level of annual cash flow flexibility within your budget.
Commissioner Robinson?
I'm not a bond person or a financier, but do you recommend borrowing as much as we need immediately, or in one, and then taking it in our steps, or can we borrow and then go back and borrow again?
We'll show it to you in a couple pages. I think the quick answer to your question is we're going to borrow for this in pieces. That's our recommendation. Borrow for it in pieces.
In pieces, but then the coverage rate will go down or up, whatever, will become worse.
No, not necessarily. Actually, borrowing in pieces will help that coverage ratio, because we're only going to borrow it in essence sort of as we need it. So the idea is to kind of layer it in over time as it is able to be absorbed by the revenues of the system, but also as it's able to be spent by your various utility departments. So as we talk about that 140 million, the idea and the goal is that's going to be borrowed in pieces over time, not all at once.
And the cost of bonding is worth borrowing it in chunks rather than borrowing a lot and then taking it down.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Given the sort of maybe evolution of your capital program, we kind of like the concept of adding it in different pieces, such that again we can bring it online, so to speak. We can have those payments start not all at once, but allow it to kind of gradually fold into the budget. So I think from a ratepayer perspective, that sort of phasing in over time is going to be advantageous to the ratepayers and to the budget, if I'm answering your question.
Well, we're going to be going out to bond separately for each new request. I mean,
correct. But
okay.
I think if you give us, yeah, in a couple pages, we'll give you some more details on it.
Phones off. Music off.
On page number 10, so we've talked about the rating agencies and how they look at things. We want to just give you a snapshot of the variety of different criteria they use when they come up with a credit rating for a revenue bond like we're talking about here. And so there's a variety of different factors at play. Notably, they're going to want to understand what the local economy looks like. They're going to want to understand what some of the operations of the system look like. But the things that are most within your control from a financial perspective are going to be those debt service coverage, reserve levels, and sort of your rate setting history and what you've done going forward. So we give you that just as maybe a little snapshot to give you a sense of all the various factors that the rating agencies will look at. But what we're trying to focus on for at least this discussion is those that are going to be within your control, within the finances, and how we can sort of maximize those. So with all that as background, we wanted to just introduce for the moment the concept. I think we've kind of covered this a little bit, but if we were to say, you know what, we don't want to do anything going forward, and we don't want to restructure our existing debt, which we'll show you in a couple pages, what ultimately does that really mean for the systems and the ratepayers and for the city itself? And so to us, as we look at the various cash flows and the size of the capital program, the do nothing to us approach really means that you don't have the financial capacity to go out and make those investments that'll be important to running the system in a sustainable manner over time. So what we wanted to do is to find a way, which we'll see on the next couple pages, that we can get done what you've identified on the new capital side while resetting your debt profile to make it more cash flow advantageous as well as more legal requirement advantageous. We'll talk about what that means, and do that with a minimal impact to annual rates. And so we understand in your position that's going to be an important topic, and so we're obviously cognizant of that, and the goal is to minimize, to the extent possible, the need for future rate adjustments for any of the various utility funds that we're talking about. So on page 13, we've got maybe a lot of words here, but I think in summary, our first recommendation to you is that we take that existing debt that we introduced a couple pages ago, and we really, what we call restructure that, which basically means we're going to go issue some new bonds. We're going to pay off those old bonds, and that's going to do a couple things for us. Number one, it's going to free up a lot of cash flow that's going to allow us to borrow some more dollars and make those investments in the system that, as we understand it, haven't been done for years. The second thing it's going to do is it's going to free up some of the legal requirements with those old bond issues. That goes away, and we've got an ability to make things more flexible for you in terms of combining and looking at the combined utility as a whole, as opposed to just maybe focusing on water and electric, the two sort of large pieces at the moment. So we'll talk about what that looks like financially, but it's this concept of restructuring the existing debt has both financial flexibility positives as well as freeing up some existing, we'll call it legal covenants, that'll help you going forward as you think about the overall utility system. So on page 14 is the same picture we showed you at the beginning, your existing utility fund debt profile. As Joe mentioned earlier, your annual payments are about $7 million a year. As it stands right now, there's actually ramp up a little bit, which is a bit unusual for utility system. We're used to seeing those payments in utility systems be pretty level over time. When they're level over time, it helps spread the cost of the capital over the users that are going to benefit from that over years and years. And so you see that ramp up visually, and then it kind of drops off a cliff there out in 28, 29, which maybe on the graph doesn't seem like it's too far from now, but it really is 8 or 9 years from now. And so what we want to do is find a way to help spread the cost of those existing payments over a time period whereby the users that are going to benefit from it will help to pay for it over time and allow us to make those new investments in the system without impacting what we currently have budgeted for annual debt service. On page 15, we've given you just some details here on the two loans that we'll recommend that we do restructure. Again, left-hand side there, we called out the 2015 master lease. That's really the energy performance contract that Joe mentioned earlier. And on the right-hand side, we've got the 2013 revenue bonds, sort of the remaining outstanding balance of that. So the two of them together is about $57 million. I'm going to round that up a little bit, about $57 million. And they are paid entirely from electric and water. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pay off that existing $57 million or thereabouts, or we're going to replace it with a new $57 million that has a payment structure that is much more advantageous to you budgetarily. And we'll show you what that looks like visually in just one more page. On page 16, we've made a variety of assumptions. When we set this up for this discussion today, these are, I would say, our best estimates as we know them right now. We've attempted to err on the conservative side with things like what the interest rate will be on the new borrowing. We've assumed, for instance, that this refunding would be done on a taxable basis at an interest rate of 4%. We've been talking with your bond counsel, sort of your legal counsel on these matters, as well as with staff. And we think that a portion of this will likely be done on a tax-exempt basis. And so what that means is, in typical situations, a tax-exempt interest rate is lower than a taxable interest rate. So for planning purposes, we've tried to err on the more conservative side, say, all right, let's plan for the higher interest rate. But ultimately, the hope is, we don't know this yet, but the hope is we'll end up at a lower place interest rate-wise than what we've planned, and thus the cash flows all look a little bit better than what we've planned for. Councilman.
Commissioner Hardy.
That's right.
Could you just go into why more of it can't be tax exempt? According to bond
well, it really is it's a tax code provision question, and bond counsel, the folks that really are the experts there. But there's a variety of provisions that you have to sort of comply with in the world of tax exempt finance, and one of those has to do with when you refund existing debt, what the time period between when you refund it is and when the bonds can be paid off. And so as we did some of our initial numbers, we assumed, you know what, by virtue of the tax rate changes or the federal tax code changes of a couple of years ago, back in 2017, changed the rules a little bit about how you look at refundings. And so bond counsel isn't done yet with the full analysis. So we said, for the moment, you know what, let's err on the more conservative side and assume that for whatever reason, whether it's the prepayment provisions or the use of the proceeds, maybe more of that has to be done on a taxable basis. But we've understood from thus far is that a decent portion of it we would expect to be done on a taxable basis. Excuse me, tax exempt. Thank you, Joe.
Vice Mayor?
If we're looking at a bond rating and we're going to refinance, are there other banks out there, say a Wells Fargo or a credit union, that would actually give us a bond rating? Do other banks give bond ratings, or no banks give bond ratings?
No, banks don't give bond ratings. There's independent agencies. There's really three primary. There's Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which are the two that you have your existing general obligation credit ratings from. And there's one other, which is Fitch Ratings, that is kind of the third of the major credit rating agencies. And they're all independent rating agencies.
And if
Joe used to work at Fitch as well. So
if we are going to refinance, is it to our advantage to look at other banks, a Wells Fargo, a credit union, to see and let them compete for our money?
That's the idea. And so what that credit rating is going to let us do is open up more possibilities, whether it's the banks, it's probably more likely the public credit markets, given the size of what we're going to be talking about. It's probably going to be about $100 million between the refunding component that we've talked about, plus some new money, meaning the new capital projects. And so given that size, it's a pretty decent size, especially for a local government of your size, getting those independent credit ratings is going to open up as many possibilities as we can in terms of who could provide the funding, basically, who could lend us the money. So it may be some component of some banks, it may be some component of some other outside investors. Those rating agencies being independent is helpful in the sense that their word, their reports, their ratings are widely viewed across the credit markets, and it's kind of the good housekeeping seal of approval from the lending and investor community.
Thank you.
So on page 17, we'll show you a similar page for water and for electric. We wanted to show a bit of a before and after, as we've talked about this concept of restructuring and resetting the payments and making it more advantageous cash flow wise. And so hopefully on page 17, this is a visual that will help to explain that. What we're showing here is your your water fund debt service as it stands right now, and that's in that blue line. See, that blue line starts at about 3.5 million, kind of ramps up a little bit, and then falls off. That's the before. That's if we did nothing. That's what the payments look like. The green bars, which you notice very quickly, instead of being at $3.5 million, are down below $2 million. That's what we've estimated the payments would be after we did this restructuring, and doing it in such a way that we are hopeful and expect we'd have an investment grade credit rating. So what it really ends up doing is taking your annual payments from about $3.5 million down to something in the $2 million range, maybe even a little bit less. And so that's the first important point. It frees up that annual cash flow to allow us to, again, layer in some of the new investment that was introduced right before us in terms of the CIP, and do so without having to go back into the budget, into the ratepayers, and say, hey, you know what, we need some more dollars to make a debt service payment. Councilman.
Commissioner Hardy?
Sorry.
Excuse me, Commissioner.
So basically, by carrying more debt for longer, we pay less for it on an annual basis. Okay. So we'll be carrying debt for longer.
That's correct.
Okay.
That is correct, and it's a good point. So what we're not talking about here, and if we can make a personal finance corollary, maybe if you've had a mortgage and maybe you want to, or car loan, anything of that variety, and so maybe that interest rate on your mortgage or your car loan is, I'm gonna pick a number, 7%, and you said, you know what, hey, rates have dropped, and I want to refinance that mortgage or car loan for some rate that's lower, say it's 5%. And by virtue of doing that, my interest rate is going to, my payment is going to drop. That's what we typically talk about as a refinancing, whereby we're keeping the same final maturity and we're just trading a higher rate to a lower rate. What we're talking about here is a little more holistic in the sense that we're not only going to hopefully achieve some nice interest rates, because they are very low right now, we're also going to totally reset how our annual payments are made and make them much flatter, much smoother. Because what you really typically see with a utility system, and again, a mortgage is probably a similar concept, or a car loan, is you like to see predictable annual cash flows. And so what you have right now is a payment structure that is higher than what's going to allow you to make investments, and it actually goes up a little bit. What we're shooting to have after this is all done is something that gives you a much lower level, spreads it over time, so that the users of the system, whether it's electric, in this case it's water, are allowed to kind of pay for that over time, as opposed to be burdened with all of it, sort of right now, so to speak, over the next 7 years. So
We free up our cash flow to do more projects, and we also help to increase our bond rating
correct,
for the ability to lend.
correct, and it's really that freed up cash flow.
Lowering our debt service.
Yeah, lowering your debt service on an annual basis. What will likely happen, almost certainly happen, given what we're structuring here, is you will end up paying more over the life of the loan. So we want to be clear about that. That when you think about a refinancing, they're usually doing that such you pay less over the life of the loan. What we're talking about here is something whereby you would pay more over the life of the loan.
It's a 30-year mortgage or a 15-year mortgage.
Correct. And to use that corollary, we're really going from a 15-year mortgage to a 30-year mortgage.
Gotcha.
It would be at a fixed interest rate with set annual payments, and so I think that's important. And again, kind of speaks to the mortgage corollary. But it is, and to Mayor's point, I think that probably the perfect analogy here, maybe for the public, is we're paying a 15-year mortgage right now, and while in one sense that may feel good, the problem is the payments on that 15-year mortgage aren't allowing us to fix the leaky roof and to fix the AC unit that's down and make some of those improvements to the home that's going to help maintain or enhance the value of your home. And so what we're talking about doing is saying, you know what, let's, instead of paying a 15-year mortgage and paying it off fast, let's go to a 30-year mortgage, and that's going to free up the capacity to fix the roof, repair the AC unit, fix the leaky pipe, whatever corollary you want to use of the house, which is going to help maintain the value of that house and hopefully enhance the value of that house over a lifetime.
Then the question would be, are there any prepayment penalties?
Yeah, and so
Would not be nice.
And so what we would expect right now is these bonds will be sold in the public credit markets. what is typical in the public credit markets is that for a 30-year bond issue, which is what we're talking about here, about 30 years, the first 10 years of that loan have what we'll call a no-call period or no prepayment period. The last 20 years of that loan, you would be able to prepay sort of when you get to that 10-year time period. And that's going to be when the majority of the principal balance is going to be becoming due. There's been some evolutions in that in the public credit markets, but basically that's a pretty typical provision. That's, I believe off the top of my head, the way that your road bonds were structured in the public credit markets with that 10-year no-call period.
Commissioner Robinson?
And with this option, our bond rating is going to stay the same.
It was so you actually don't have a bond rating right now on the revenue bonds. And so your existing bond rating, the general obligation bonds, is entirely separate and aside. So what we're talking about is going and getting an entirely new bond rating for the utility enterprise system.
Just, okay.
That'll be based entirely on the cash flows of the utility enterprise system.
And after 33, are you going to give us a second option?
Well, we'll talk through maybe. I think we certainly can run some more.
I like choices.
That's part of the reason for us being here. But I think we'll show you visually what we're thinking about when we run all this, and hopefully it'll make some sense in terms of your ability to do some new money on top of this restructuring. One other
Hardy?
important point. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, just on this chart here, right? So basically, typically, the kind of flexibility that you might want, right, after you've paid off that 15-year mortgage, right, which is why you got it, right, because now all your income belongs to you, right? You don't have to pay Wells Fargo or whoever made your mortgage, right? That flexibility is typically desirable, but the only reason why we won't be able to get it was because if we don't go from that 15-year mortgage to that 30-year mortgage, we just absolutely will not be able to take care of this capital program that we'd like to have.
Given the magnitude of the capital that's been identified and the level of payments you have right now, it would take a very substantial increase in your revenues. And so let's use that mortgage example again. You basically have to get a big old raise to be able to pay for that 15-year mortgage and make the investments in the system that are required. And in this context, that raise really comes from the ratepayers. And so what we're trying to do here is to make sure we can balance that need to invest in the system, and again, to fix the leaky roof and fix the AC system, but also limit to the greatest extent possible the need to go to the ratepayers and ask for more money, basically.
Okay.
And as revenues increase for the city, you have that opportunity after 10 years, did you say?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
After 10 years, that if things improve, then you can pay it off sooner than later. You don't have to go the full extent of it without having to raise rates.
That's correct.
Excellent.
That's correct. Yeah, electric is a very similar picture, so we're not going to necessarily go through that. Same concepts, but what we're really trying to do is to free up cash flow capacity like we've talked about. So we've alluded to this, so now we'll talk about we've done this restructuring, again, using the various assumptions we just talked about. Now, what does that help us do in terms of new money? What does that help us do in terms of new investment in the system? What's it help us do using that personal finance corollary to help us with the leaky roof and the air conditioning that needs fixed? The answer in the short run, and again, these are estimates right now. We're going to continue evolving on this before you would be asked to formally approve anything, is that by virtue of that restructuring and resetting the annual payments lower, you're able to layer on $22.5 million for both the water and the electric within the same annual payment you're making right now. So you add those two together, what basically this allows you to do is take on another $40 to $45 million of new investment in the system without having to increase your annual payment. And so Again, we'll try and make a personal finance corollary. We've gone from a 15-year mortgage to a 30-year mortgage, so now our payment is lower. And that freed up cash flow within the budget, we're going to dedicate towards a loan that is going to help us fix the roof, fix the air conditioning, fix the leaky pipes, et cetera. Again, with the overall goal of enhancing the value and maintaining the value of the asset that you own. On page 21, we just want to demonstrate real quickly, if we were to say, again, you know what, let's not do the restructuring. Let's leave the existing debt profile the way it is, and still try and layer on the roughly 45 million we just talked about on the prior page. What does that look like cash flow wise? And I think this actually goes to Commissioner Hardy's question earlier, which is, I don't know if this laser pointer works over here, but you see the annual payments on the left-hand side if you didn't do the restructuring, and they go from roughly 4 million right now all the way up to 5 million plus. And so you're actually increasing the amount needed to make your annual mortgage payment, so to speak, by about $1 million if you don't do the restructuring. But if you do the restructuring, you're able to incorporate all of that within, again, an annual payment of about $3.5 million. Again, fixed interest rates in set annual payments over the life of the loan. So we just wanted to show you that, and Commissioner Hardy, maybe that's helpful again to your prior question. At this point, we can jump back in here, talk about what that looks like rate-wise.
It's taller than I am. Okay, so we're trying to take this as a process step by step. So we do our restructuring, and I think the way to look at it maybe is that to some extent, we're outsiders. Okay, we're new to you a little bit, but one of the observations is that the city has fought pretty hard to equalize or normalize its electric rates with the competing private sector utility, and getting there has sort of reset the competitive landscape. If you've got competitive electric and other utility rates, the economic development community is going to be more likely to invest in your community. If you're able to put more money back into your businesses, meaning your enterprises, and provide good and reliable and stable service, that's only going to further the development environment. So we look at the restructuring as sort of a parallel track with what you've done on electric rates, in that now we're trying to reset the competitive landscape from the standpoint of your debt portfolio. So getting the debt restructured, freeing up that cash flow, and allowing you to make those investments should have a return to the city in the form of a more positive development environment, because you'll have those reliable, stable utility enterprise systems. So I kind of want to just in transition sort of make that point. The next phase of this is, so we free up the ability under your existing 2020 utility budget to do the 40 to 45 million of new utility investments. So what comes after that? How do we get to the next incremental 100 million of that $140 million CIP? And that's really an iterative process, in the sense that if you are willing to do, and again, this is a policy decision, this is not a formal recommendation from us, but if you are willing and able to, after making those initial investments, look at something like a cost of living or an inflationary sort of adjustments annually or periodically to your utility rates, you're going to free up more capacity to get more projects done. And those are sometimes tough decisions to make, and we want to share with you a little bit of the modeling that's frankly still a work in progress, but have you get a sense more so for how we're looking at it and how we're thinking than necessarily what's on the printed page. So this is a very busy slide, but it should be somewhat familiar to you, because
Stanton model.
These are the Stantec budget models, and this is their sort of dashboard. And what we've done as far as this goes, in order to sort of save you and the taxpayers some money, we basically have taken the modeling that Stantec has done with all of these combined utilities and basically put them all together into one model that we can work and understand the cash flows. In other words, we didn't go out and recreate Davenport's own model. We used what you'd already bought and paid for. And so there's some key line items in this, and I know it's hard for the public to see. I don't know how well it's coming out on the two screens, but a couple of things we want you to focus your eyes on this page. About a third of the way down, you'll see a line item called Senior Lien DSC. DSC stands for Debt Service Coverage. Okay, and then the next line to focus on is the gray row, Days Cash on Hand. And so what this particular page, it says no rate increase at the top. So if the city did no rate increases, what happens to your senior lien debt service coverage? You see that it starts off pretty strong. Again, your minimum legal requirement is 1.2 times or 120% of debt service. You eventually, by 2025, go below that. You no longer meet your legal requirement if there are no rate increases. And you'll see in the gray line, the days cash on hand, that pretty soon thereafter goes to a negative number. So, and what this includes is the $45 million of new money borrowing that we're talking about, and it includes the restructuring. So even if we do the restructuring, if we make the investments in the system, we still can't do all that without some form of rate increase. Does that make sense to everybody?
That shows no rate increases on any of the utilities for the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, ever.
So we're just going to quickly step through a couple of other iterations just so you can get an order of magnitude. The next one we call scenario 2, and that's with the rate increases that you have already adopted as part of your 2020 operating budget, at least is my understanding. And again, going to that debt service coverage line, you see we get another year effectively. We don't go below 120 in 2024, it's now 2025. And our days cash on hand stays positive for longer, again, by about a year. But again, we go negative. So the actions you've taken for 2020 are a very solid start. You don't, frankly, based on what we've shown you for the 40 to 45 million, you don't need to, as a practical matter, you don't need to make another rate setting decision for at least a couple more years. But eventually what this is showing you is eventually you will have to make that rate setting decision. But by the actions you've already taken, you've set yourself up for a couple of years of stability if you choose to go that route. And the next one, this is sort of, this is an interesting case. This basically gives you an idea of if we raise our rates on what I'll call, with the exception of the sewer rate increase, which one has already been adopted, and I think one's been discussed to some extent. The rest of these rate increases are all in the realm of what I'll call cost of living, inflation. We all know in our personal lives, we talked a lot about the sort of corollaries and analogies that, the cost of a loaf of bread goes up every year, the cost of a gallon of milk. Well, the cost to operate, cost to, buy chemicals for water and sewer treatment processes, those costs go up every year. So basically, by just raising your rates to keep up with the cost of doing business, you're able to significantly improve your financial metrics. And again, the senior lien debt service coverage line item, this really gets you to where you need to be. You'll see that it never drops down to 1.2 times. It stays in the call it on average, 150, 160 coverage. But it does come with the rate increases that you see here. The only utility, and it's significant, the only utility that we didn't include rate increases on in this scenario is electric. Said to ourselves, if the private utility provider isn't raising rates, we're not going to raise rates either. Well, in reality, they're going to raise rates from time to time. but to be conservative, we've assumed nothing. So you'll see that a regular pattern, which most utilities nationally do on an annual basis, they review their rates and charges, and most utilities do some form of inflationary adjustment to keep up with the cost of doing business. The price you pay in not doing regular rate increases is your revenue requirements, which is the cost of operating the system and your debt service and the like. They go up every year, and if you don't match it with regular rate increases, that pressure builds and builds and builds until such time as you have rate shock. You have to do, 2 or 3 very large increases to catch up. So we'd rather have regular, smaller, more manageable increases that the ratepayers can deal with in their own personal household budgets than a rate shock situation. And then the last scenario is same as 3, except that we brought electric to the table in terms of 3% annual increases. And this is really, you walk into a rating agency with these kind of metrics and you're going to get a very positive reception.
It hasn't switched.
Oh, I apologize. Did I not switch it?
There you go.
Okay. So
Stay close to 2. Straight through.
Yeah.
And the 2 is straight through.
it's a lot of material to throw at you. I've got a few closing remarks to make, but I wanted to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions on all of these numbers and the like.
Commissioner Hardy?
I had a question, I think on your 3rd slide.
Scenario 3?
Eluded me now. Yeah, there were many. Just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Front to back. So I've gotta. I'll just hold it. I had it at the moment.
Okay. Well, please jump in if it comes to you. Okay, so I'm going to go forward to slide 27. So the next, what we're effectively asking for you to do as a body this evening or at a soon subsequent meeting is to effectively bless this concept. We've done a fair amount of planning work to date, but we have not fully engaged the city's bond attorney. There are some preparatory steps to taking this to the public markets in terms of formal legal financial documentation, the new master resolution that we'll need that's going to replace the Bank of America master resolution. There's an engineering and a feasibility study that needs to be done to give investors comfort that this is all put together in a way that is reliable and will work. We've received proposals from Stantec to do that work, but we've not formally engaged them and contractually committed the city to any of that, because we wanted to come here tonight, run this by you, make sure that you were comfortable with it. So if you so choose and you're so willing, what I think staff and Davenport are looking for is some sort of vote of confidence that this is a plan that you'd like to pursue and a path you'd like to go down. That will signal to us that we can start working in earnest on this and bring this to market. Based on the current timing, if you will, of where the market is, the municipal bond market tends to get very cluttered and busy at the tail end of the calendar year. By about mid-December, lots of investors, mutual funds, insurance companies that buy your bonds, they basically close the books for the year and they're off for the holidays. So we can use the next 2 months to work in earnest on some of these preparatory steps and then bring this bond issue to market, both the restructuring and the new money, at the beginning of calendar year 2020, probably mid to late January, with the eye towards having funds in the city's hands to start making these utility investments by early to middle February, hopefully at the latest. So that's sort of the working plan. The next step where we would probably formally ask you to take an action formally as a body will probably be sometime in the November, December, more likely December timeframe. And what that's going to be is the new master resolution that bond counsel will draft. And that's going to both authorize the issuance of the bonds and commit the city to those rate and other covenants that you already are living with, but we just need to get out from the Bank of America one and start afresh, start with a new one that fits the needs of this particular unique security structure, which is different than what you have now. So your only formal action, the go-ahead, the green light to get going really can just be almost, I leave it to you, a straw poll. But the formal legal action that would be a recorded vote would be the adoption of the master resolution, hopefully probably about 2 months from now.
Commissioner Robinson?
I was just asking for another option from the pages 17 and 18. Do we have another? Could we look at another choice? Will it? Do we need to? I don't know. We went from high to low, and we're good in the middle. I like that, but is it possible to have the green lines lower than they are? And secondly, I want to make sure that this is going to satisfy all the department heads going forward. And thirdly, I want to thank Bruce for bringing you on and your clarity and transparency. And I really appreciate I didn't like it at first, and I was just afraid of it, but I really think that this is a good, transparent, open way to look at our budget. Thank you.
While we can take no official action, such as a motion, I'll bless the concept, for my, I'm 1 out of 5. While I wish it weren't necessary, it is. And so we have to do what we must. I think where we're going to have some serious discussions is not whether to do this, but how. And that again goes back to the few pages of models that we were shown, how to proceed as far as rates go and how much comfort we want as far as debt service coverage in the future. I think those are things to discuss, and to what extent can we be expected to compete rate wise with larger providers that have tremendous economies of scale that we don't. But that said, obviously the general idea is a sound one. So you have my blessing.
Vice Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you, Joe. I have to tell you, I've been on this commission for a long time and have heard a lot of presentations on a variety of very complex issues. And I want to thank you for this presentation because it was easy to follow along with. It was easily understood. I think that anybody that was actually listening and paying attention could actually, even if they didn't know anything about what we were getting into this evening, they could go through it and be able to keep up with where we were and where we need to go and how we're going to get there. So thank you very much for that. I was especially appreciative of your ability to bring this plan together in such a way that it takes into consideration the anticipated competition we're going to face with the private sector going forward. I think that's very important as it speaks to our desire to continue to make Lake Worth Beach a place that folks want to come to. Okay, and this, I think, the way you put this together helps us to do that. So thank you again for your very well thought out and executed presentation. I do have a question for maybe the city manager, and the city attorney's not here and the finance director is here. But as we talk about combining all these enterprise funds and coming up with one loan or one bond issuance or a series of bond issuances, if you will, to cover the various enterprise funds, will that require us to do anything as far as the enterprise funds structure or the ordinance that creates them or anything like that? We don't have to tinker with any of that, right? So all these enterprise funds will remain exactly as they are in terms of their existence and what they do, and so we don't have to do anything. We don't have to.
Yeah, part of part of the of that new master resolution is how the funds will flow. Your enterprise funds will each be accounted for and operated and managed separately as they are today. Each director will have the same responsibilities they do for the purposes of paying debt service on the bonds. The funds may be temporarily diverted through a trust account and captured there, debt service siphoned off and set aside to pay debt service as it becomes due, and then the monies would flow back to the individual funds for their normal operations and use. And the mechanics of that need to be detailed and worked out, but that's effectively what's happening.
That's the devil.
And one more thought. And it's a little ahead of the premature to have this comment and/or this discussion, but I do want to speak to Commissioner Hardy's interest, and even I think the mayor comment a little bit on this. You know, as you mentioned, sir, it'll be 10 years before we can actually consider. Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
As you mentioned earlier, it will be a minimum of 10 years before we can actually consider if we are in a position to pay off or pay down, if you will, any bond proceeds. I just want to make a statement to the commission that as we consider this proposal and as we move forward and potentially adopt this proposal, that we also keep in mind the idea that we should come up with some sort of an additional plan, if you will, to what I'll call it squirrel away. Any revenues that we may generate over the next several years that may be unusually more than we anticipated, and put them in a pot. So when that 10-year period is up, we have potentially a substantial amount of money to pay down the bond, as opposed to, gee, we're doing really well and we got all this revenue and we got this money and we're spending it. And then the 10 years comes and we're still stuck at that same payment for the next 20 years beyond that. So does everybody understand what I'm trying to say about that?
Yep.
And I think we need to commit to putting some money away, coming up with a model or something that we can put money away if it's available to us solely for that purpose. So after 10 years, we can start thinking about, paying down that debt and, essentially paying off your 30-year mortgage in 20 years or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that's actually fairly common.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Best practice.
And if I may comment on Commissioner Hardy's remarks, which I appreciated, that you're right. How much, I forget exactly the phrasing you used, but I think the point you were getting at is how much of that safety margin do you want to have? Do you want to hold yourself to, well, you're going to have to hold yourself to the 120 rate covenant, but do you want to hold yourself to a 150 rate covenant, a 140? And there's a balancing act there. I mean, sometimes it's not worth it to chase the highest possible credit rating. That's going to make your cost of capital lower, but it's also going to drive the rate increases higher. There's always a balancing act there, and every community, based on its demographics and its history and so forth, has to come up with that balancing act. Those were just snapshots designed to show you sort of barbells around where you are, where you possibly could be, and there's any number of possibilities that lie between those barbells that we're happy to, with Stantec, run those cases.
Want to address it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, we have two somewhat competing goals here. Obviously, we own a utility. Obviously, it's very difficult for a utility of this size to compete rate-wise with a utility of a much larger size. And to the extent that our utility has some things it has to do, it would be really financially feasible, right? Just make the equation work better with rate increases. However, on the other side, we're also a city that's trying to, compete for good residents with other cities in a regional area. I mean, there are 39 municipalities in Palm Beach County. We want the best residents. West Palm wants the best, et cetera. And so we can't be too out of line with, what our private sector competitor is doing, even though that private sector competitor is much more capable of doing that. And so there's a balancing act that we have to do. And that's going to be interesting to see, whether and where we can find that balance. That's probably it's going to be where the rubber meets the road. Do we want to go through these next several years with our teeth clenched, or do we want to go through there with considerable room? And as a guy up in Boston would say, a margin of safety. That is Seth Klarman. That is, kind of the choice that we have. So I appreciate your very clear report. It was very clear.
Thank you.
No, I really appreciate all the time that you've taken to.
I'm sorry we've taken up so much of your time.
No, this is a great discussion, and it's really I like, just as Commissioner Robinson, having this nice, open, transparent conversation about how we do this and look at the funds. And your analogies and the way in which you presented was very good for everybody. Looking at these numbers that we're talking about, paying up to 3.5 and above in payments on, say, a 15-year plan. I think it's a no-brainer that we're looking at, sectioning it out over the course of years and creating a consistent payment that we know that we can pay and handle, and be able to fund a lot of the important projects that we need. One of the questions that I had asked was similar to what the Vice Mayor Pro Tem asked was, do you have to do anything because of the different funds, and because there's like division of church and state, this fund, you can't use money from this fund to pay for this fund and vice versa. And I had asked the city manager that earlier today, and he says, no, this is, you're using it together as a whole, say that's the budget, but the individual funds stay individual. There's not monies going from fund A to fund B, so everything stays, of course, good. I'm thrilled with this. I think this gives us a great opportunity to move forward.
Madam Mayor, you may want to consider, just as an exercise, but also to show sort of a show of hands, can you use your Trainovations thumb so we can I get 2 thumbs up, 3.
Is this a
4?
consensus? I'm good with the.
Are you going to vote?
No, that's
that we got
See your
tonight.
thumb, Herman.
I don't
Don't
need
use
a
that
thumb.
word.
I can
Don't
speak-
use the
I
word.
can
Use
speak
your
words.
thumb.
There you go, thumbs up.
No,
Well, we will get to work in earnest on this. Thank you for your time and attention, and appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Madam Mayor, I also don't want to miss the significance of finally getting to this point with the organization and with the utilities, and especially the electric utility. It's transformative because for years we've talked about fixing significant problems in the asset. The distribution system mainly is what we're talking about here, and delivering electrons to people's homes and businesses. And it hasn't always been a good thing in this city. More recently, we've done a much better job of fixing and repairing and keeping things running well. This is truly catching up on 40 years of benign neglect. I can't point to any one thing or person, or it's just something that happened over a period of time, and we could talk about the history of that. But the fact is, the residents that you represent own this asset. They rely on this asset for their electricity, and so fixing it is a very responsible thing to improve their quality of life and the value of their asset. And I want to compliment you and staff for all this coming together. This is a significant moment for this city, not to be missed, and I applaud you for it.
Thank you. Let's take a quick break before we get into the general. We'll be right back, folks.
Downtown, did you?
Madam Mayor, we're live.
All right, everyone, I'd like to reconvene this Thursday, October 10th, City Commission work session, capital improvement budget, with item 3B, the 5-year general capital improvement plan.
Madam Mayor, Commissioners, now on to the second part of tonight's workshop. We're going to be talking about all the deferred capital projects that have been sitting around, as well as some road projects and items that are in the non-utility side of the wheelhouse. You each have before you spreadsheets, of which I'll bring Bruce up. It's basically the same kind of a conversation here. In the spreadsheet, you have, over the 5 years, projects that are either funded with PAYGO or other sources, or they're in the unfunded category. Mr. Miller, it's yours.
Yes, thank you very much. As Mike noted, they're the same presentation, if you will, similar to the utility funds, but this is for the governmental funds. So again, I'll start with the summary schedule.
Does everybody have
We
that
are on.
government funds?
Yes.
Okay.
So we start off with the general fund for fiscal year 20, and then go out through fiscal year 24. And just for the general fund, you'll see the general government, the police, fire, library, leisure services, with a subtotal, and then street maintenance. On the detail schedules, the street maintenance is separate because it's really its own activity, its own program. But for accounting purposes and available funding discussions, we added together, so the total general fund for fiscal year 20 is $4,703,000. However, $2,126,000 is funded, and we'll get to the details later. If you can allow me to get through the presentation. And then, so the fiscal year 20 unfunded is $2,005,000. So, not reading each year thereafter, for that period of time, the 5-year requested funding is $12 million. Again, $2,001,000 already being having identified funding sources for a net of $9.9 million. The beach fund is $680,000. Again, it has revenue sources that are available for funding. So the total 5-year request is $980,000, $250,000 of which has identifying funding for a $730,000 total. The golf fund, $125,000 for fiscal year 2020, and a 5-year request of $375,000 with no available funding. The garage fund, and I should say the garage fund is also the fleet maintenance program also, and so you have several components. 1.5 is their portion of the new facility, and then thereafter, the $350,000 is the vehicle replacement program, of which each year that has available funding. So the total for that fund is 2.9, of which 1.4 will have available funding, with a $1.5 million net request. The IT fund for fiscal year 2020 is $400,000, and then there's no available funding throughout the 5 years, for a total request of 5.4. The grant fund is for fiscal year 20 is $467,000, of which $397,000 has available funding, and there's no request thereafter. I'm sure that through the years, once we get the funding, we potentially may have additional requests. The neighborhood road bond is 13.125, of which we have available funding of 13.125. That's the road program, and this is the appropriation that needs to be had to authorize the expenditure of those funds. So the total neighborhood road program is 13.125. Again, total funding available and identified is the same, so there's no requested funding for that. So you'll see that bottom line, all year, all funds for fiscal year 20, we had $21 million of requests. And then throughout the 5 years, the requests minus the funding solutions, we have a net request or a net request of $18,039,969.
5-year plan.
5-year plan. Now, with that, there's a schedule that has the detail, just as the utility presentation. I'm sorry, Commissioner Hardy.
What does net request mean?
It's the requested amount minus the funding.
That would be the unfunded portion.
Exactly.
All right, the portion for which we have no money.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well said. So again, we went through a lot of this. I just want to highlight some things. You have the details for each request, and the description, the summary totals match up to the summary sheet, but this gives you a very, very detailed analysis. I also highlighted the areas that have funding. If you take a look at this schedule here, you'll see that those are the areas that have funding and from where those funds are coming from. So if you want to get very, very granular, we have the opportunity to do that. And just I know we're going to get in a lot of detail and you're going to have a lot of questions on specific projects. But just as a general overview, if you can give me a few moments. Again, this is a very, very comprehensive list. And it's intended, because we're going to get into some difficult conversations, I'm sure. So this list is meant to provide you the information that you need to make those conversations, or to have those conversations. Some of this is deferred maintenance, or most of it is deferred maintenance, and we definitely have to get in front of the curve. One of the fundamental constraints that we're dealing with, especially in the governmental funds, is our revenues are constrained. It doesn't mean that they're locked in, but they're definitely constrained. For example, the ad valorem taxes, we're pretty much maxed out on our capacity to increase taxes. So we're largely dependent on new growth, be it new growth, new development, or additions, if you will, improvements to existing homes. What we have been living on is the increase in market values year over year. And the city has been very fortunate that has received those market increases year over year. But we can't continue to rely on those increases. We do not know when there's going to be an economic event that could change how those properties are valued. The local receipts, same type of conversation, is another category of revenues. So we have to be diligent on how we evaluate existing fee structures. And I know there are always sensitivities between how much you charge the external of the enterprise funds. But as much as we possibly can, is always a policy decision, and I recognize that, is that we want to be able to get as close to capturing full costs as we possibly can. Again, understanding there's sensitivities with that. And we have to look for, and continue to look for new revenue sources as we move forward. Grants and other outside funding sources are always a potential, and quite honestly, we're going to be doing a little bit more work up in the finance department to see what we can do to get more activity, if you will, from that. But those opportunities are difficult to obtain on an ongoing basis, and you really don't want to be overly dependent on grants. Another thing we need to do is start looking at
I'll wait until he's done.
fund balances. There are several funds that have deficits, and you heard the financial advisors talk about the importance of building fund balances and building cash reserves as we move forward. 30% is a AAA, 25 somewhere in there is a AA rating. So we want to move across the board. We want to raise the tide on all those funds and start managing those funds. And that will be conversations. I'll be recommending fund policies, fund balance policies, and that kind of thing as we move forward. But we really need to start, really looking at that. Another concern is budget constraints. And budget constraints are, those non-controllable expenses that are throughout the budget. The health and pension costs, they keep going up every single year. Police and fire, those expenses can continue to go up contractually, and need to decrease the enterprise funds transfers back to the general fund. We've talked about as a policy decision that we really need to wean ourselves off from those transfers from the enterprise funds to get to a reasonable payment to the general fund. These are incremental steps that we have to take. We can't do it all overnight, but we have to start moving that bar as we move forward. And then we need to talk about the need to have a pay-go, capital pay-go. We talked about, doing the leverage right now, but as we move forward, it's for ongoing capital program, for roads, for example. Those type of activities that you do every single year, you really want to get to a pay-go methodology. Otherwise, if you borrow $2 million this year and $2 million next year, and every year you borrow $2 million for roads, for example, well, over a period of time, you're paying more because you're paying interest on that cumulative total. If you would just have paid that $2 million out of fund balance, you would be ahead in about 10 years, okay? So those are the strategies that we have to start moving to. It's not going to be, again, it's not going to be overnight, but when we talk about capital programming and how that weaves and dovetails into the operating budget, those are the conversations that we have to keep being reminded of. And then, so where I want to bring the conversation, and I guess conclude the conversation, is so we recognize that there's over a 5-year period, $18 million of deferred maintenance and requests that we have to, that are being brought forward. How do we fund those projects? As I said earlier, there's not a whole lot of room to do borrowing in these funds, because to do so, we're maxed out on our levy capacity. fund balances, there's not a whole lot there because, as you heard the FA, we don't have a lot of surplus fund balance. So really what we're looking at, and I know you all realize this, but the elephant in the room is then having the conversation of sales tax as being primarily the large pot of potential funding to do a lot of these requests. And I just, final comment, I've seen a lot of communities when they do new capital, sometimes they are not always appreciative of the future carrying cost of that capital item. And I've seen it time over time. And I'm not going to make any prejudgments, but as we move forward and you evaluate, that's why the detail schedules are so important, that we do understand the carrying cost of these programs, because it's critical in the long term. It's going to catch up to us in the long term. And if our budgets are constrained, as noted, and our fund balances are constrained, as noted, we have to be very, very careful of those projects that we move forward. And so in summary, it's advantageous to have a return on investment. And return on investment, it does not always mean that you have a surplus revenue. There's different ways to measure return on investment, mitigation of costs or future capitalization costs, avoidance costs. Those all are part of the conversation. But I just, as we move forward, or as you move forward in the deliberations of these different projects, I just put that on the table for consideration. So with that, I'll look to to city manager as how you want to proceed.
Commissioner Hardy, you had something?
Sure. I got 3 items right up front. The first is, can we talk a little bit about the tax deed acquisition related to the CDBG parkland acquisition? That would be line item 70, at least on the sheet that you gave us earlier in the week. That's line item 70. On the sheet that we got this evening, that would be,
Should be 72.
okay, yeah, also 70. Okay. No, it's 68C on this sheet that we got today.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so we have gone through the process with the county. We're a subrecipient of CDBG funds. We applied for these CDBG funds, telling the county that we're gonna buy some land for a park. We have everything we need except for all the land that we need. The last piece is a property that we would need to buy the tax deed.
Get the
to
tax
acquire.
title, right?
Okay, but that's unfunded.
Correct.
Okay. Now, this, whatever we whittle down, I mean, because most of these are unfunded, right? So whatever we whittle down and decide to appropriate, right? This is gonna be a budget amendment. It's gonna go into the budget that we passed a few weeks ago, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
And if I may add,
right.
that's a very important piece to this conversation.
Now, 2 separate budgets.
It's a amendment to the
Right.
fiscal year 2020 budget. So anything that is on the schedule, even the things that are highlighted, need an appropriation.
Correct.
There's a funding source identified, but the appropriation is not there.
Now, here's the thing. I don't see any revenues on this page other than sales tax, grant funding. pay go means that there's already some cash that we have somewhere, right? So I guess what I'm wondering, there are other revenues that don't appear on this page that were a part of the operating budget that we passed, right? But we could have potentially cut some things out of the operating budget to make room for some of these things on this page.
So as a point of clarification,
Yep.
that would be pay-go.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
So if you want to cut a program up top to fund a request here, that would be into the pay-go. So the amendment would be to decrease X budget by X amount.
Okay.
And then that dollar amount would flow down to your capital budget.
Okay. All right. I obviously think that we have to find a source of funds to get the $70,000, to get the tax deed, to have that land, to complete the whole thing that we envisioned when we applied for the grant. We don't do what we said we were going to do, we're not going to get the grant. So we have to find a way to do that. I would prefer not to do it from fund balance. Obviously, we can't do it from grants or sales tax. So if we could look at something in the budget that we passed. I mean, I wish I had it in front of me, but I actually have it in the car. So that's number one. We got to come up with the $70,000. The other thing is police and fire. There were, so there's like $150,000 for the elevator, which is important. Apparently the elevator goes out from time to time in the public safety facility. I don't know that that's acceptable to me. I don't really think that it is.
What are the people that got stuck?
Right. And then there's the roof replacement on 1229 Detroit, fire alarm upgrade, 1220 Detroit. There are also things that the manager and I have discussed there that are more, I won't say cosmetic, but that have to do with the quality of life of the folks who work in there that aren't on this sheet that should probably be considered, but I understand we're trying to tighten our budget here. But both of those items I think should be addressed in some way. I'm willing to discuss potentially sales tax for that, but I would prefer again that we find something out of the budget that we just passed to cut to fund what would be a combined what was that, 4 and change, 440. I guess I'm really bad at arithmetic. And the last thing is there are lots of requests here, and in every part of our functions here, what I do not see, and some of these requests we didn't ask for, their staff brought them to us. What I do not see is the controversial item, which is the pool, which would obviously have to be, funded and appropriated. And I'm wondering why it wasn't included in these potential capital items. Obviously, it would be a capital expenditure.
Isn't that part of our penny sales tax discussion?
Lots of, but there are things here that are, there's a column here for penny sales tax. So these things are a part of our penny sales tax discussion as well. I don't know why the pool would not be here. And then you mentioned some big picture items, what we have to do long term to not have a situation where we have $21 million in funding requests in a year and only $16 million of that funded. What we basically need is growth outside of the CRA area that we do not have to subsidize with tax abatements. That's absolutely critical, right? And that's what we have not had a lot of. We've had some of it, some new stuff on A Street north of Lucerne, and all the way up to the north. But we need more of that. And I think when we look at our zoning code, we should look at areas that are outside of the CRA, zone them robustly, remove uses from the conditional use table and put them, move items from conditional use to by right so that people can just invest in the city without having all that because it's affecting the conversations that we're having here. So. I'm interested in how we're going to pay for that tax deed acquisition though, and the police and fire.
Mr. Robinson?
Well, I'd like to just point out that this is a 5-year, we have 5 years to address all these requests. And was interested in what isn't on the list that you came up with, Commissioner Hardy. I thought we just about covered everything that they could ask for, but what are we missing on this list except the pool?
Downtown parking.
Madam Mayor,
Please, City Manager.
I just asked the finance director, I didn't think there was anything in the sales tax column of anything recognized in this list as that being a funding source. So while some of the other columns have funding or money already committed, there's nothing currently in this list that's being identified. So the funding source conversation and the prioritization of these items.
The sales tax column is only being checked off if money has already been appropriated from
Correct.
sales tax funds there. It's not for future use of sales tax dollars. That's what was being mentioned.
But what he
Correct.
just said was that the only other source of funding that we have to fund any of the stuff on this list would be sales tax.
Which is
That
the
was what he
next-
said at the beginning.
Right, which is the next discussion that we have at our meeting on the 7th.
Well, on the 17th, we're going to have our kitchen table conversation about the beach and any other sales tax conversation. But anything that, for example, the conversation about garage funding wasn't put into this
Correct.
funding
understand.
discussion. These were items that had been deferred,
So-
and then we included also the road, the PCI program.
Okay. Vice Mayor?
Well, I just wasn't quite finished. I just want to make sure that we understand that these are 5-year requests. And there's certainly a lot on here that don't have to be done this year. And I thought I understood that we had a consensus to set aside a certain amount of money from the penny sales tax for the improvements at the Oceanfront Park. So if we could back into these requests after recognizing that we did have a consensus for a certain amount, or not even a certain amount, but for the Oceanfront Park, then we could really talk about what we want to check off this list. Now, I don't know when, we put off the elephant in the room for so many meetings, and now we're putting it off until the 17th, but not necessarily, because we still have to address all the requests on this list.
I think what happened was that the last time when we were talking, we were told, if I'm not mistaken, that staff wanted to bring to us
Their needs.
their capital expenditures before we had this discussion about the penny sales tax. That's what I remember from the last meeting. So I knew that this was going to be a discussion about capital expenditures and the needs of the department heads, and then the next discussion was going to be about the penny sales tax. So I don't see any issue with that. I understand. I've been with you, in the discussion about the pool. I'm looking forward to discussing the pool, but right now, I thought this was about actually getting out on paper and us being able to see what the needs of the city were.
The one item, Madam Mayor, if I could, that definitely bridges this conversation is as we move forward with the utility side of the bonds, there was the issue of the motor pool garage building and its proportional division among the funding source on the bond side and then funding on this side of the equation, which is $1.5 million, that we haven't identified a funding source for. That was the only, I think, other thing in here that was talked about in the conversations previously with the sales tax that's on here.
And having been there just recently, it needs to be addressed immediately. Immediately. Sorry. Commissioner?
Well-
No, I'm sorry. You want to finish?
Okay,
Then
yeah,
Vice
go.
Mayor.
We'll be here for a while.
Okay, I wanted to weigh in a little bit. So I actually took the liberty of putting them all in different buckets and then trying to prioritize. Like the mayor said, I've recently been to that location and it's in seriously bad condition and it needs help. Also, I look at the health and safety issues that may be around some of these. I think there's 4 elevators that need to be updated. That to me is a health and safety issue in our buildings where the public comes. I also took Parks and Recreation and put it in a separate bucket, and it's almost $2 million, and that across the city. This is where our children play. Again, it's a health and safety issue, and I think if we were to put $1 million in that bucket and then went to Tallahassee and asked for appropriation for the other $1 million, we'd have a good chance of getting it. And then in the meantime, there's a lot of grants, a lot of other things that we could apply for. So right off the bat, I'd like to see us put $1 million from this penny sales tax on something that could bring over 30 projects to the city of Lake Worth Beach. And again, it's where our children play, it's where our families go. And these are things that have been put off for years. It includes a little bit of the beach, some of the health and safety issues there. If you remember, we had to take out our park facility. We have crumbling banners and things that are actually, I mean, we call it the beach park, so therefore it could fall into that. I also pulled out IT. If you remember, since we've been here 8 years ago, we haven't really addressed IT. And I made a little note in the IT, sitting on boards for the Florida League of Cities, Palm Beach County League of Cities, I wrote down cybersecurity issues because every board I sit on, we talk about the cybersecurity issues. Palm Beach County had huge. Riviera just recently had it. So I'm not the IT person, but I feel that that should be a priority. If it's something that jeopardizes the health and welfare of the citizens and our IT issues, that we need to look at that. Golf course, Compass, Hatch, these are all our, Benny's on the Beach. Benny's on the Beach is missing from this conversation at the moment. These are our tenants. It is our responsibility as landlords to take care of our tenants. And again, it goes back to health and safety. You know, I think all of these have needs that, you know, should be addressed with the penny sales tax because it brings the value. And going over all these different funds, I still think that there are some grants out there. Working with the librarian, we've got some new grants that we found in the CRA that works for the library that this is the first time we've seen a grant that actually may help with some of the structural things. But again, we have to apply for the grant and see if we get it. But a lot of the grants need 50% match. I totally think anywhere that we can spend that penny sales tax and do a match that is more of a guaranteed structure, I think that's what we should be looking at. That's all I have at the moment.
City Manager, how did you perceive this conversation to go forward without being a discussion about the penny sales tax?
Well, I was just about to ask for clarification, Madam Mayor. Vice Mayor Amoroso has provided some what could be direction, and I'll need to get that thumbs up from all of you guys, of going after, for some of these categories, funding which would require matches for state grants or an allocation. I'm not sure exactly which one you're talking about.
All of the above.
State, federal, I don't know.
State, federal, anything we can get our hands on.
That's not a sales tax per se item, but it sounds like you have certain priorities
For sales tax.
for these topics.
There's other ways of paying it other than the sales tax.
He was asking you, I believe if I might, saying that could we provide from the penny sales tax
Correct.
the match
Mm-hmm.
to set aside an amount that we need for whatever to match
Correct.
what we might apply for.
Because it's all
I
infrastructure.
proceeded with this workshop and asking staff to look at the deferred capital needs of the city, because we're in the throes of doing an appropriation and creating the capital improvement plan for the city. And, you know, you've dealt with the big half of the elephant in the room. There's still a lot of stuff here that you need to see and as policymakers be able to pick through, but you can't do that if you don't know what it is. And that was the idea, was to pitch it out there. Doesn't mean that you can't defer some of this. Obviously, it's a large nut to crack. We don't have $18 million. But we need your direction on how to proceed with what you do want to do and how you want to do it, or if there's an ability to find some creative funding sources, or to take, as Commissioner Hardy said, dive back into the operational budget and look at it closely and say, we're going to shoehorn in this because it's one of our priorities. And my hope is that this is all done in the context of the strategic plan, the comp plan, and everything that you've set as priority and goals. This is genuinely a moment for y'all to strike this budget and make it align with your overall priorities as the policy board for this community. And that was my hope.
I just don't want to sit here for hours and hours and hours and go through every item and say, I think that we need to go back, each and every one of us, and digest these items. We've seen these items, and then go back and look at the regular budget, number one, and then look towards the conversation about the penny sales tax. Because us going forward, item by item, to say yay, nay, yay, nay, yay, nay.
Well,
I mean, if we have to do that, we shall. But I mean, I think it's better off if we can come to say, okay, these are the amount of funds that we need. We've got this in the general budget that we're looking at, and this should be allocated towards here, and we can make the amendments as needed. Yeah.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but on this particular issue, what I'll say is there's a premise underneath this discussion that I'm not sure I accept. The idea, that we should dive back into the operating budget. There's a budget.
Right.
It has operating expenditures and capital expenditures. We just chose to talk about operating expenditures first. But these sorts of expenditures are going to be paid out of the same money.
Right.
And so that's why I felt we should have looked at them all together, because we were looking at a picture that was incomplete. Now we're going to have to go back and look at a budget we already passed and alter it,
Right.
amend it in order to amend it.
But we
right?
knew that.
Well,
We had
Yeah.
done that before, but we knew that
right.
this year.
And the other thing is, look, we have, as a small city, we have limited political capital. The legislature hands out money for stuff that is of statewide importance, job creation, environmental stuff, things of that nature. I do not want to waste our political capital going to the legislature of the third largest state in America and asking them, can you help us pay to resurface our basketball courts, resurface our tennis courts, refurbish our playgrounds, replace our bathrooms, put sod on our soccer fields? These are not issues of statewide importance. I don't even think it's a legitimate ask of the legislature. I don't even think it's a legitimate approach to go to the legislature and ask them to do that. Let's not waste anybody's time by thinking for a moment that that would be a useful approach, because it's just not. These are things that we have to pay for ourselves, especially with the ideology of the people who are in the legislature. They expect us to pay for these items ourselves. We cannot escape the difficult conversation that is our duty by pushing that off on the legislature and hoping and waiting and praying for a miracle during the legislative session. Also, there are other very important items that we need to get appropriations for this year, such as the $2.5 million for the Gulfstream Energy and the over $600,000 for the sea level rise. Again, that's an issue of statewide importance that I don't want to muddy the waters at all. I want us to go with as much firepower behind the asks that we have, rather than diluting our political capital across issues that we're not going to get far with the legislature on to begin with.
No, I understand why you say that, and I appreciate your saying that. The thing is that there are programs out there
Yes.
that are provided every single year that they give us the ability to apply for them.
Those are grants. Those are
well, there-
legislative
There
acts.
are both. There actually are both. There are some that come out of the state that you can actually apply for this, that does give money for playgrounds and grass and different things that come out of the legislature each year in different segments. So there are places for that. Vice Mayor, you've been holding your breath. Go ahead.
Thank you.
And your light doesn't work.
Yes, Bruce, could you tell me where on this budget you could add a line item that I could get 3 AAA batteries so my light works? And I could have a robust,
Is it useful life over 5 years?
yeah, I'd like to have a robust participation.
At least you all have a light.
Well, you don't need a light, you got the hammer. Okay, I kind of like to share with you, Bruce, what I thought we were going to be doing here this evening. And the first thing I want to share and ask for clarification is these line items, which is wrapped up into this one page.
Yes, sir.
This is a 5-year look at the things that we have deferred. And I think we need to think about what that means when we say deferred maintenance or deferred capital projects. We haven't done them. They were necessary, but we haven't done them.
Correct.
And I was of the impression that you were bringing together the things in the city that need to get done. They're not nice to do items. They're must do items. They're things that we've deferred for whatever reason. Won't pass the blame on anybody, but these are things that got to get done to make the city function properly. Is that a correct statement?
I will say this, that they are deferred items. If you continue to defer these items, the costs will incrementally increase over time. Then you're forced with a policy decision relative to discarding the asset or not continuing the program, whatever may be the case. But by and large, these are deferred items that that staff recommends movement on.
You know, I'm not sure how I want to express this, but I'll just say it. If it sounds political, then it's political. But, you know, my whole purpose for ever getting involved in this community at this level was to go back and try to fix some of these things that have been going on for years and years and years and years and years. I've spent 8 years with Mayor Pam and Commissioner Amoroso, you know, trying to position ourselves in very much the same way the consultants earlier told us, so we could actually start functioning like a normal municipality with a decent credit rating, the ability to borrow, the ability to plan our future, the ability to create projects and implement projects. They're going to create an interest in people wanting to invest in our community. And when you do it that way, then things get better economically. What we've done historically up until the last 5 or 6 years is we've gone the other direction. We've kicked the can down the road. We've chased shiny objects and spent a lot of money on shiny objects. We've not addressed our neighborhoods. We didn't govern very well. It was a spiral down a race to the bottom, if you will. The city is positioned right now to go in a different direction. And I think what I expected tonight was to see a list, and I think that's what you're telling me I have here, a list of the things the staff says, we got to get these things done just to catch up. These aren't things that we'd like to do. We just, you gave us blue sky, tell us come up with all your dreams and wants or whatever. These are need to do, must do items. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I want to establish. The other thing is, I didn't think we were going to get into a conversation about sales tax dollars or whether or not we're going to use sales tax dollars, but since it's been brought up, I would like to point out that, according to the backup material we have here this evening, just in the next 5 years, do the must-do projects. The must-do projects in our city, we need just a hair over $18 million.
That's correct.
Just in the next 5 years. Well, if you want to talk about the sales tax money, we only have $16 million left. The next question I have for you is, where are we going to get the revenues, potentially, if we don't use sales tax money to address these capital needs? Now, I can tell you one thing. If anybody thinks for 1 millisecond that we can go back into the budget and start cutting here and cutting there, and we're going to come up with some real money to make a dent in this capital project, I got some swampland I want to sell you, because it ain't going to happen. There's not enough money in that budget that you could cobble together of any significance to move forward with any of these capital projects. So I just want to establish for everybody's edification and the public's edification that we have $18 million worth of must-do projects that have been deferred over the years because we've been chasing shiny objects or because we didn't do the right things we were supposed to do in the past. And now it's come home to roost. We have to deal with that now. And we're not going to have another opportunity like this, I suspect, while the 5 of us are up here, to be in a position to actually clean the slate and get caught up that we have right now. And if we're foolish, we're going to blow that opportunity.
Well, if I may I respond? this is very similar to the conversation we had on the enterprise funds or the utility, combined utility. It's trying to do a reset and then moving forward. And, I enumerated some, revenue constraints and budgetary constraints, but trying to move forward with those constraints, but also trying to identify a pay-go methodology so that these items don't become deferred again, so that we have time to transition from because again, we don't have the capacity to borrow, so we're going to have to do a reset and then manage the budget going forward. There are $18 million worth of infrastructure requests here, as you noted. By and large, it's the penny sales tax that would be available. I mean, there may be a penny here, no pun intended, but small dollars, if you will, that may be targeted. But we do not have a source of funds of any magnitude that, for example, can do road surfacing or road improvements throughout, in the years out. So that's the conversation that needs to be had.
Question for you.
Yes, ma'am.
So you're saying that everything on this list are must-have, can't be held back any longer. We've got a lot of things under leisure services, right?
Well, those are the policy conversations and discussions.
You said everything on this list was must-have, can't wait any longer, we must spend on. That's what you just asked. And that is what
These are just,
That's what he said.
priorities.
On them.
No, but it was just asked, is everything on this list something that must be done because we've kicked the can down the road too long and these projects must be done? And I look at this, a lot of the stuff in Parks and Rec to say that, well, we're severely lacking in that department. We still haven't done a Parks Master Plan. I'm looking at 4 new scoreboards. Are the ball fields, all 4 ball fields being used?
Yes.
They all are 4. I've never seen anybody on those fields, even on the weekends. So we've got all 4 of those that have to be replaced. We've got exercise equipment. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
We're looking at roofs and things falling down and elevators broken and whatever. I get that part. But I'm saying, if you're looking at this, not to say that you don't need those things, no disrespect, but to say, I'm saying that I thought this was life and death and public safety. Isn't that what was mentioned tonight? So that's the stuff I'm looking for on this list. Roofs falling in, yeah, I know roofs falling in. The public works building falling apart, I get that. That you can see that stuff is being done. Plumbing in the bathrooms, $50,000 worth of plumbing here at City Hall. Do we need $50,000 worth of plumbing, or do we just need it to be fixed for right now?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Right.
I'm trying to put a realistic look at this. Stuff that's benign neglect that's going to eventually blow out the roofs and walls of the project if the plumbing isn't fixed. I get it. Needs to be addressed. But let's call this what it is.
Right.
Okay. What?
and to your point, Madam Mayor, I understand where you're coming, but even if we back out the leisure services, their entire budget, their request, it's only $2 million. You're still left with $16 million of capital needs.
What I'm saying is that we need to go through these item by item, and I don't know if we're all prepared to do that right now. To look
Well,
through
that's not the purpose of tonight's meeting.
Well, that's what that's why I asked the city manager a short while ago, what exactly did you hope to accomplish? Because in this point, now this becomes a match. Okay? We like this one, we don't like that. We can literally go through all 78 items. Say yay, no, no, yay, yay, yo.
The intent was to show you the scope of a 5-year plan. In year 5, are things falling apart? Well, in year 5, obviously, they would be in year 1 if they were imminently about to implode. So there is some gradation across this discussion. But for the most part, the items listed are either currently in need of some investment or projected going across the years. And that's the conversation that we need to have at the next meeting, I believe, in more detail. I would like to know, though, based on what you know now and presenting this publicly and having this conversation, would you like to proceed in a more detailed fashion where you go through and prioritize these? Because we need direction on what they are. We put them out there. These are items that we know we need to take care of either this year or in the next 4 years. And we don't see a place in the budget cycle of the normal funding of the growth of our revenues, and we've had those conversations. It's time for us to really have those honest conversations about how we can find funding and work this budget out, because I still want you to not get you need to get completely bogged down in making decisions, obviously, about what we're going to do here. But there are strategies and conversations about fixing the business model long term based on things you've talked about in your strategic plan that we need to get down into plans of action. And I always use the education example, even though we're not the school district. Schools matter to attracting families and folks to move here, to buy property, to invest, to become residents, and to pay taxes and to become part of the local economy. We need to get down and get about the business of what are the things you want us, and what do you want to do, and start clicking it down there to prove those schools. And our measure is going from a D, a C, to an A. And that becomes what we set about doing. We don't have money to do a lot of other things. And I use that as one example because we know that bringing infill and refill of residents to the city is vital. It's going to be one of the things of many. That's not a budgetary conversation. It's talking about solutions. That's going to come out of this conversation. But I do need direction, though, and it's a hard decision. For years, I think the organization and to some extent myself, when I presented budgets, I knew you didn't have money. So these things never got past the finance directors preceding Bruce. We can't have that conversation anymore. We're having issues with facilities, and people are asking why these conditions exist in this city. Why isn't it pushed out there? With this capital improvement plan, we're having a very honest, open, transparent conversation about the needs of the city. Y'all need to tell us how you want to rank it. That's a little more than you asked for.
Yeah. So first off, again, the first thing is, it was said that there's no way to go back into the budget and find any real money for any of this stuff, right? And I'm wondering, the first night that we were asked to vote on what is a portion of the budget that we need, none of us had line items. None of us had a line item budget for that, and we were asked to vote on it. There was no way that we could think intelligently about what we were being asked to vote on and its implications. So I think before we say that, we all need to get a copy of a line item budget and go through it and determine that for ourselves. Okay, well, what I know is that on night one, first reading, none of us had them. We had a programmatic budget. None of us had a line item budget. As a matter of fact, Bruce, I asked you, you just gave me yours, right? Do you remember that night?
Yes.
None of us had line item budgets. We had a big picture programmatic budget.
We had line items delivered to our offices before the start of.
I did not have a line item budget delivered to my office. Not a line item. I had to take Bruce's the night. Okay. We're talking about on the first reading. The other thing is we're looking at this separately from all the other revenues that are paid for, as far as our general government services, right? And so really there's stuff in the general fund that we have already passed that we're trading off here, but we're acting as if all that stuff is set. We can't touch it. And we just have to pay for this stuff out of a small portion of funds elsewhere. That's not the case. We need to compare what we need here with the budget that we already passed. The other thing is, if you look in these sheets that they gave us, not all of this stuff is the sky's going to fall if we don't pay for it, because on each sheet, on the top right-hand corner, they have a priority for each of them. Some of them are high priority, priority level 1. Some of them are medium priority level 2. Some of them are priority level 3. So for example, the Interceptor vehicle, which is really cool, it's like a 3-wheeled vehicle for parking enforcement, that was a request for the 2020 budget year. That's not something that, it's an absolute must-have. And if you look at it, it actually says low priority on the thing here. Where is it? This thing right here. right? And so not all of this stuff is, the sky's going to fall, the place is going to burn down. So all this low priority stuff needs to be weeded out, in my opinion. I don't really know what the purpose of this discussion was. I really don't. I don't know what we were brought here to be asked to do. What I feel is that, there's a pot of money that we've been having a discussion about, which is about the penny sales tax. And before we have a real discussion about that, all the other things are thrown at us to discourage us from spending money on the penny sales tax on something that people asked for repeatedly.
Madam Mayor.
And, I really don't like that. I don't know what we're doing here this evening. I don't, we could have gotten a report and read this.
I had them, they had their buttons on first. Commissioner Robinson?
I agree with you, and Commissioner Hardy brings up a good point. I completely disagree with Commissioner Maxwell in that all these things are a must-do item. I mean, shiny objects, show me one. And they're not deferred. These things, if we didn't have the penny sales tax, these things are budgetary items. And, let's put them in a budget, not look to
They wouldn't be funded.
a gift to take out of. Our job is to set policy, and now we're going to start checking off what departments are going to spend on a ATV or whatever. We should be budgeting for roofs, and elevators are new now. This is a new life safety issue. They're inspected every year, aren't they? And if they're not safe, then they wouldn't pass inspection. If the roof is repairable, we can repair roofs. I mean, seriously, these are operational issues that we're not up here to really get into. And we as a commission have set. I thought we had an understanding that we were going to use the penny sales tax to address the future in terms of what a Lake Worth is going to look like and be. And how are we going to brand ourselves with a new scoreboard? I mean, seriously, I am a fantastic supporter of Parks and Rec. Every other city that has taken penny sales tax has put money into Parks and Rec. So I consider our oceanfront park a priority out of the penny sales tax. And we did have a consensus that we were going to address the oceanfront park out of the penny sales tax. And now if we're going to go back on our word and get into the budget items in detail, I think we're jeopardizing the trust of the public when we are starting to flip-flop with every item that comes up. The next, I can't think of the next thing that is going to be a life safety issue. Maybe stop signs. Are we going to put that in a budget here? I just, this is frustrating for me because we've had problems for at least 6 years or 8 years, and we've had I've heard a lot of talk about bright and shiny objects, and I'm really frustrated with indecision on branding Lake Worth as the ability to make a decision and move forward. We don't talk about revenue in these things that could, I'd like a workshop on possibilities of revenue. I don't know what else we're going to accomplish tonight, but maybe it's a good start. Maybe it's a step backwards. I'm tremendously frustrated with the new things that keep coming up that are I don't want to say a distraction or a diversion, but we know that these things should be done over the next 5 years. Let's not stop everything and solve it in this first year when we have a fund that can take us into revenue and take us into the next 20 years. if we're investing in ourselves in terms of branding ourselves as a city that recognizes the health and safety of children and invests in teaching kids to swim, and a lot of other things. I don't know what else we're going to do tonight, but it's.
Vice Mayor?
For the record, I just wanted to reiterate what the mayor alluded to in reference to Tallahassee. I've been traveling to Tallahassee for the last 8 years on behalf of the residents of Lake Worth Beach, and I travel with a lot of other cities that have asked for these same asks and have been funded. If it's the wish of this dais not to ask the legislative body to fund some of these items, then I say, put $2 million of the penny sales tax and do over 30 projects. You get your bigger bang for your buck. And again, I can't remember most of the meetings that we have. At least one person gets up and talks about the parks. And again, I agree with the mayor that we need a master over plan, but that was really to address future parks and where they would go and what it looked like. It really didn't, at that point, we weren't addressing maintenance of parks. And, if we can't take care and maintain, and some of them, they may be a scoreboard. However, it's also where the children and families go. It's what we offer them as Lake Worth Beach. So, I think that particular package or bucket, so to speak, we can get our biggest bang for our buck and show the residents that we are investing back in our parks and our recreation.
Thank you. I'm not really sure where to begin, other than we'll start with this and work backwards. First of all, there was never a consensus, okay, to earmark X amount of dollars for that pool. Okay, now I'm being told that's the case by staff, because my understanding when that vote was taken was that there was, I thought the vote was being taken to designate X amount of dollars. That was how I walked away. I voted against it. Okay. Staff tells me, oh no, that wasn't the vote. That wasn't the motion. The motion was, there was just an agreement that the beach was going to be a priority and some money would be, okay. Don't know where that is either way, but I do know this. I do know that at least two members of this body had made it very clear in those conversations that they had no interest in hearing what staff needed to get done in terms of their needs. In fact, they actually said something to the effect, I want to get this done and the money committed before staff has an opportunity to bring their needs forward for everybody to see. Now, let's talk about the trust of the public. What kind of a statement are you making when you tell the public that, you know what, I've got a pet project here that's going to cost a lot of money, that's going to service a very few people, and I don't want staff to bring forth their critical needs, the deferred needs, if you will, because I don't want to hear that, because that's going to cloud my ability to make a good decision when it comes to spending lots and lots of money for a project that only a few people are going to benefit from. So that's where we are. Again, I came to this meeting thinking that staff was presenting us needs that they have, not wants, not wishes, but these are absolute needs. And that's how I'm going to go forward in my thinking as we go forward to this. And Madam Mayor, like I said, even if you want to, and I'm a big supporter of recreation, even if you back out the $2 million, we're still $16 million. And that's only for the next 5 years. What happens in year 6 and year 7 and year 8? We don't have revenues coming in at a clip high enough to cover these capital needs going forward. And we may not be able to. And as the key word, the operative word here was reset. Reset, reset, reset. This city was, I don't know how to say this. Overall, for the first 100 years, we didn't do all that great a job for whatever reason. We ended up in this place. But we've worked really hard over the last 8 or 9 years to reset. We talked earlier tonight about resetting the utilities and getting us squared away there. This is an opportunity to reset our capital needs and get, these deferred projects. And I'm just flabbergasted that any of us could have a conversation about dumping millions of dollars in the doggone pool and ignoring things that have been ignored for years and years and years in the city. That's all I've got. And I do need 3 AAA batteries.
I just want to say something too. I just want to get involved if you don't mind. You guys go back and forth, and sometimes I sit back. I don't know where to even begin. This list, like I said, is not just have to have it today. You know, these are things that are part of the process that we go through every year. And every time that we talk about a budget, or we have in past years, we've said that this is a moving document. This is something that's moving, and it isn't set in stone because things change. The one thing that these budgets don't provide for is the actual number of growth, investment, whatever that happens in an actual physical calendar year. It doesn't involve any of the projects. It doesn't involve public-private partnerships. It doesn't involve grant opportunities. It doesn't involve, I mean, there are things that happen that change the numbers, why we have money left over or don't have money left over at the end of the year, or budget cycles, or where that money is appropriated. We always err on the side of caution. We're conservative in our numbers. We're usually higher in our quotes, and we come in under budget and on time, like always, because we have a fantastic crew and a professional organization. So, with that said, and I've not once looked at one shiny object in the 8+ years that I've been here, I believe in the ability to work together with everyone to make sure that our physical, emotional, financial, mental, and whatever capacity is good and solid to go on, and that everyone has a chance and an opportunity to create a brighter Lake Worth Beach. And I think that we shouldn't just focus on one thing. We have a lot of things to focus on. And I think that we can use our discussion with the sales tax to finalize and to come up with good ideas and solutions to some of these problems that we have that we need to be addressed, and also some ideas for building the future of the city of Lake Worth Beach without being heavy-handed in any one direction, but being fair and cut across all departments and all needs at this point. We have that ability. We also have the ability to grow and to increase our revenues and to look at other forms of options. And yes, as Commissioner Robinson said, to look at business plans. You know, every single decision that comes before us, you know, when we're talking about it, we're never given the business plan of operating that and what's that going to mean revenue-wise to it. We don't get that opportunity to see that unless we go out for an RFP or an ITN or a RFQ or a LMNOP. So, you know, we have to make these decisions from up here on the dais sometimes without, you know, if we were a board of directors at a major corporation, we would have those prospectus in front of us to be able to make a decision based on the financial, you know, liabilities and the possibilities of what types of revenues are going to be generated by that. Oftentimes we have to make it with our arms behind our backs and a lot of pontificating and grandstanding. Let's look at for what it is. I would suggest at this point, if we could, city manager, to let us go home and digest these items and let us have meetings with you to go over item by item the ones of most importance to us. So when we come back to this next meeting, we're able to have a civil discussion about this and really sit here. I think, you know, our time would be best spent in addressing, we've never had the chance to say every year that the budgets come before us, even when the capital projects were included in the budget, we never had an itemized list to say, oh my gosh, we're not funding 16 of those items in that problem, and they need to be done. We were never told this one of those 16 projects needs to be. Every single year, we were never told that the priority, it was never prioritized, anything that was left unfunded in a budget, where it stood in the priority list of the department. We were never given that information in 9 years that I've been here.
Critically, though, okay, I'm not sure that that's our role, right?
Correct.
Typically, how it works is department heads.
That's why I'm going. That's where I'm going with this.
Yeah, they figure out, they do the prioritization.
Thank you.
Right. They talk with the city manager. There's a back and forth. There's a back and forth between us.
Let me finish
Yeah.
this. That's where I was going with this. Okay, is to say that basically you've come into us and you've said, hey, listen, this is the drop dead. This is what has to happen now. This needs to be done. It's not going to go another year. The thing's going to fail and whatever. We say, okay, let's appropriate the money here. And if we don't have the money, we find the money and we do it. This is a lot more loosey-goosey than we've had in previous years. Not good, bad, indifferent. Just saying. This is different. You've given us a full picture, which I appreciate. It took a heck of a lot more time, I'm sure, on your behalf to do this, But unfortunately, we've been given too many options that it's a lot harder. You know, we always took just priority one. What is the, we know we've got no money. We know we need to do this. What is the thing that has to happen now and in the next couple of years? Or whatever. You're trying to plan us for the next 5 years out, which we've never had that opportunity to do before. It's always been, this is what's needed now. And I appreciate that. I'm telling you right now, I love you. You're giving us options. You're setting us up for the future in a way that I'm very excited about. But with this said, unfortunately, the heavy-handedness in some ways of the pressure of every one of these projects needs to happen now is really playing in a negative way towards the next conversation that we have. And I want to make sure that everyone stays open to these conversations, that we can work together to solve them and address the needs of staff, address the needs of public safety, address the needs of building the city's future, and we can do it in a fair and equal way and still utilize our balance. That's all I'm suggesting, and I think to go on any further than this is just going to be a pissing match back and forth. City Manager?
Madam Mayor, maybe at the next meeting, we can bring back a better shrift of the data based on the prioritization, which has been brought up several times. We gave you the full scope because we wanted you to see, as you said, exactly in a 5-year capital program, this is how it should be done. You're not capable of funding this full thing. We know that. Then why bring it to you? It's a workshop and it's transparent, and you need to understand that your city is not necessarily functioning at the levels that it should be, and we need to be having policy conversations about how to fix that. We've started budgeting October 1st for next year, and this will take incrementally, we've said this and I'll say it again, to change the way we function, the business model, to allow the market to respond and hopefully see some positive things happening. 5 years, we're shooting out into the future, but we're starting with this capital improvement plan with an honest, laying it out there and saying, this is what we're grappling with. Let us go back at the next meeting. We'd like to prioritize internally with the way we have it and give you that shrift of data. However, there's a couple of items that we still want to throw out there. The motor pool building was one that we've had conversations about previously. It's reflected in the other side. And I know we've had some conversations about roads, but I don't know that we're ready to make decisions at any level, but we want to focus on those when we come back as well.
And I'd like to have a conversation with you too, just with my insights, and
Sure.
I encourage you all to do that. This is, I think that what we're describing right now with our not understanding is going to help shape the way things are presented in the future. And they're offering, if you would have been here years before and saw how it happened, they're providing us with so much more information. I love when people say, you're being, what's the buzzword? You're not being transparent. Gosh, we're being like a bajillion times more transparent in what we're sharing with the public on it. Yeah, we're sharing so much that it's kind of upset the process for it, because we're not used to having all of this information all at once in just little pieces in the past. And we're definitely not used to having 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5. This is new. So I think it's going to help us in the future. And I think it's going to help us the next meeting.
Look, clearly we can adopt different processes for budgeting.
Yeah.
What I'll say is, today is the 10th, October 10th, 10 days after the start of the fiscal year, 10 days after what the statute says our final budget should be submitted to the state. October 10th is not the time for us to whittle down capital projects. The time for us to do that was a long time ago. And here we are 10 days after the start of the fiscal year trying to figure out whether or not really whether or not things can be funded, because we know most of these things can't be funded. But we're trying to have a discussion that we should have had in April and October. That's number one. It should not have happened this way. That's number one. Number two, don't give us stuff in a meeting that you're saying, should we appropriate this, should we appropriate that, when we don't have the funds to appropriate it. And we're given this stuff in a meeting that we can't even take official action in the first place, right? So I'm not really sure, again, like, this is a workshop. We can't take official action if we wanted to. And also, most of the stuff we can't take action on because we don't have any money. I don't even know what the point of this is. This is something that happens internally upstairs or in that blue room back there. This is not,
So this is too transparent.
it's not really about the transparency. It's tardy. It's tardy, and this is not the time. In October 10th, you should have given us a budget of stuff that we could fund, or don't give it to us.
Consider
I'm
this,
sorry.
Commissioner, a early start on next year. Then we're not going to proceed in a process where
you know what? I'm gonna end this right now because going backwards in the discussion and comparing woulda, shoulda, coulda, whatever. Can we just move forward?
Madam Mayor, I object to the tongue lashing that's being given out to staff right now.
You
Okay?
can object all you want.
And I will.
Well,
It's
excuse
much
me.
deserved.
Let's talk one at
It's
a
not
time.
much deserved. You don't know what you're
Point
talking
of
about.
order, one at a time.
You,
One at a
sir, don't
time.
know what you're talking about.
Right.
It's October
Correct.
10th.
Yes, it is.
Arguing
Point
about
of order,
budget just 10
point
days
of
after the
order.
Fiscal year started.
I'm
We've
gonna
been
adjourn
having
this
these
meeting.
conversations
I'm gonna
year
adjourn
after
this
year
meeting.
after year. Where have you been?
Meeting's adjourned. Meeting's adjourned.
Can we
First of all,
propose,
that's not within the
Can-
rules.
can we-
The
I'll be a
government
bully.
I
requires
can't have a
it.
work session.
can we propose a future meeting about revenue?
We're having a meeting on the 17th.
And will that include revenue?
no, we're going to have those conversations in a structured